Hi, I'm Brent Messenger, Vice President of Public Policy and Community at Fiverr. Welcome to Connection in the Time of COVID. It's no secret that COVID-19 has fundamentally changed the way we all think about community and the way we develop communities when previously normal face-to-face interactions are suddenly a health risk. Going forward, more and more people are going to be working and even socializing remotely by choice or by government mandate, which begs the question, how can we form authentic relationships, build communities, and create meaningful connections with people from a distance? As a community leader myself, I'm super excited to be joined today by David Siegel, CEO of Meetup, who has rapidly become one of the world's leading experts on the topic of building connection in the time of COVID. Some of us thought we'd never do. And in the next 45 minutes, we'll talk about how Meetup has made the shift from being primarily offline events community to being a leader in providing resources and connections in the virtual space. So with all that, welcome, David. How are you and where are you?
What a loaded question that is.
Well, I'm in California, so I wanted to know, how socially distanced are we?
Fair enough. So I'm in New York now. When we used to tell people that I was in New York, everyone would say, oh my gosh, how is it in New York? That's so scary to be there. And now people are like, wow, it looks like it's become one of the safest places to be, certainly on a.
Right, who's laughing now?
So yeah. The experience of running a company that is all about in-person connecting, where we basically said that our entire focus is using technology to get people off of technology.
Yeah.
Now, if we got people off of technology, well, people couldn't connect. And we ultimately realized it's not about, kind of as a company, in-person connections. It's about keeping connected and keeping communities connected and doing it in a safe way. And with COVID, the only safe way is through virtual, though we'll talk a little more about later on what we're doing in terms of a movement in certain locations, especially in Europe and Asia, kind of back to in-person as well. But I'm good. Family's healthy.
Great.
That's the most important thing.
Good. Well, that's good to know. So yeah, before we dive into all that, it's funny because Meetup is one of those brands that's been so successful at doing what it does that the word, the brand name has become synonymous with the idea of community gathering, right? I mean, it's like Band-Aids and Velcro and Meetup, which is outrageous. Fiverr should be so lucky someday. But just to give it people, who've not participated in Meetup, I've been to, I would guess, probably hundreds. But for the people who haven't, give us a sense of the scale. And you mentioned a second ago, sort of worldwide ambitions. Where is Meetup? How many people are going to Meetups annually, maybe prior to COVID and that?
Sure. So we're the world's largest platform for building community groups and organizing events. We have 330,000 groups on our platform. One of my favorite statistics is we have 15,000 Meetup events every single day. Wow. And that spans in 190 countries in over 2,000 cities around the world. We have over 50 million kind of active members, and ultimately what we are is we're a platform. We have 50 million members on one side who attend events, and we have 330,000 groups and over 200,000 organizers who organize events. And they span from everything from support groups for parents of ADHD children. And if ADHD was big back then, perhaps my parents could have joined that. To gender identity support groups, to hiking groups, to tech being our largest.
I'm wondering, as you're saying all that, have you noticed a shift in the types of events that are popping up, the types of groups that are being formed since COVID? And I'll caveat that by saying, as a platform company, we've seen some changes in behavior, more from, obviously people are doing tons of professional projects, but now there's also a lot of personal projects. So I'm curious if you've experienced that, and I'm seeing you nodding, so I'm suspecting I'm right.
Oh no, your suspicion is correct. I'd say there's two things I would point out there. The first is, this should not be a big shocker. Our outdoor events are not exactly growing through the roof. Our outdoor events took, appropriately so, an enormous hit when people can't play basketball or play soccer or football or all the other great activities that people do. The number of events, went down outdoor by like 80–90%. What's cool though is that even for outdoor, you would think it would go down potentially 100%, but there were still running groups that would do runs by themselves, get back together on, let's say, Zoom or another platform, and all drink a beer together and talk about their run. And it was kind of a good example of where the power of community can transcend anything, including groups that are meant to be doing things in person, and specifically a sport in person. And now they were able to still have community for the 20% of groups that did that outdoors. Conversely, though, the two groups that just started really skyrocketing for us were tech groups. And the reason for that is because online is so conducive for tech individuals who are already kind of online savvy and want to create online events. Like there was an online tech group that always operated in St. Louis, and they always got people from St. Louis, and then they made themselves available online, and they got people from 30 different countries. So that's an interesting example that hundreds, thousands of groups have had. And then the second is, unfortunately, because of everything happening with unemployment, we saw an enormous growth with career networking groups as well, kind of not as a result of COVID, but more as a result of kind of larger economic issues and terminations and furloughs.
So is it safe to say that some of the geographic barriers then have sort of melted away? We've experienced a little bit of that at Fiverr as well, where something like this conversation will be viewed by people all over the world when it may have actually happened in New York City or San Francisco in a place like that in person before. Is that a trend?
Yeah, I mean, I think that people have asked us what the future of online events will be for Meetup, and I'll just share a couple of statistics there because it could be interesting for everyone listening and watching. In our first 18 years of life, we basically had 0 online events. In the last 3 months, so 0 in 18 years, in the last 3 months, we have now had over 600,000 online events with over 5 to 10 million people who are participating in our online events, from 0. And we tweaked our product, we tweaked our messaging, we tweaked every marketing communication. We couldn't have pictures and images in our marketing materials of people doing things that weren't social distancing appropriate. So
Right.
Every single thing had to change very quickly. So we did make this pivot incredibly fast, and every single month has seen an increase. Online events present opportunities that Meetup would never have had beforehand. So there's some huge positives there. I'm happy to share with you 3 or 4 examples of that. There's also negatives because as a company, our heart and soul is really in the power of in-person connecting. And God willing, when everything has passed us, we will continue to have online events, but it's very important that the online events be supportive of kind of in-person experiences as the ideal, and they don't overtake, and Meetup doesn't become like so many other social networks, and it becomes an online experience, because the power of in-person is so important. So
I really agree.
It's almost a spiritual type connection to make sure our mission kind of continues, but at the same time, like I'll give you a couple of examples of the power of online for us. So the first is that, a friend of mine lives in a remote area in Toronto, for example, and I gave the example of parents of ADHD kids, and he happens to have ADHD kids, but there's not enough of a cluster of people in Meetup to be able to be a part of it. But he can now be a part of a online group around parents of ADHD kids, or an online group of people who, so for people in remote locations, people in suburban locations even, and not in cities, where they wouldn't necessarily have been able to access Meetup beforehand, can now access Meetup. An organizer in Australia was just telling me that one of the things he loves about Meetup is the fact that it can help so many downtrodden individuals learn languages. We have tens of thousands of language meetups. But it was expensive to necessarily have to go into the city for someone who didn't necessarily have the money. And now rather than paying $25, $30 in Sydney to go into the city, now they could learn and participate for free. So it opens up Meetup to many people who wouldn't have had the option to be able to have that beforehand. And there's just a host of other things like, we really want to connect. If an organizer is organizing a LGBTQ hiking group in New York, and a new LGBTQ hiking group starts up in Berlin, we want the New York leader to be able to help to mentor the person in Berlin, to help to mentor the person in San Francisco, to mentor the person in Kuala Lumpur. And we couldn't do that when everything was very siloed with in-person only.
That is something you weren't able to do in the past, but you are able to do now, or you're working to take advantage of that opportunity?
So the answer is we're very much working to take advantage of the opportunity, in that what we want to have happen is every single time a new organizer joins us in a book club, in a whatever, where we have hundreds, if not thousands of different meetup groups in other cities, we have someone that can mentor them and help them and advise them. We could have a group of kind of an organizer group around different topics, so it would be like a meetup group for organizers. And people could really help each other, and it crosses geographies, and we couldn't have done that prior to COVID, and we couldn't have given access in remote locations prior to COVID. So there's a whole host of really great things that online opens up for us, and more importantly, opens up for the world.
Yeah, and so you're talking about the community organizers. We have a lot of community organizers actually on the Fiverr marketplace too. People that I interact with all over the world. We have about 100 chapters of organized Fiverr community members getting together to do a lot of things, previously all in person, by the way. So we're also making that shift to virtual, which has been pretty tough. But what advice do you have for community builders who are organizing remotely? It sounds like you're creating resources so that they can be mentored by other successful chapters, which that's brilliant. But what else can people do?
Yeah, so the first I would say is, it's like, what makes for an engaged community, right? An engaged community has 3 or 4 different key factors. So number one is, what I would say is, so much comes down to the organizer. If you have a great organizer, you're gonna likely have an engaged community. And if you have an organizer that's more laissez-faire, it's much harder, no matter what you do, to have a great community. So much comes down to the organizer. The second is, the more that community members can, I would say, I like to use the word, be vulnerable with each other, the deeper that community becomes. And it's amazing the depth of community and the friendships that are created because people are willing to be vulnerable with each other. It's just such an incredibly important component to community success. And then I would say, like, the continuity, community is successful when it's not just a series of random events that random people show up to, and you don't have the same continuity of people at them, but it's super critical for the success of a community to have people continuity from event to event to event, but yet at the same time have new people kind of influx coming in, to join that community. So that's just general community. I'm happy to talk about, specifically online communities, but I would say that's kind of generally true for communities.
Yeah, well, I am curious about that online communities and what makes it different. But just one comment on the last thing you said about that notion of being vulnerable. It's really one of the things that we talk about a lot, and that I try to teach whenever I'm working with community building groups is to teach people to tell a story about why they even started the community in the first place, because almost inevitably through telling that story, they're going to be vulnerable and they're going to open themselves up in a way that becomes attractive for people. So I think that's super powerful advice. It's harder to do virtually, which gets us to the conversation that you were just about to jump into, which is what makes it different with virtual versus in person. And we did already hit on some of them, but I know there's a lot more.
Sure, and I would just say that, there's a great study of what happens to the brain during storytelling. And, storytelling, I teach at entrepreneurship at Columbia University as well as an adjunct professor. I have a big section on storytelling because I think it's just so important for entrepreneurs, frankly, and leaders to be strong storytellers. And, you know, storytelling goes back to our earliest days of childhood. For me, of like lying in bed and having my parents read me a book and tell me stories or make up stories. And there's just this like, I find when I'm speaking or whatever, if I start with a story, people's faces go from, you know, looking at their phones, which is of course where they always are, to actually looking up. And it's remarkable kind of, they say that it literally lights up different sections of the brain in different ways, telling a story than almost anything else. So I love that you called that out.
Well, it's just funny because stories are obviously specific and personal when you tell your own story. But if done from the heart and done the right way with the right kind of structure, which is something that is teachable, as you probably know, people are able to see themselves in other people's stories, which is, I think, why it's so powerful. We're people want to make a connection. They're looking to make a connection. It's a missed opportunity when you don't. So it sounds like you and I are completely aligned. So what makes it different online? Can you do the same thing? Can we tell those stories, and do they work the same way? Enlighten me.
I mean, listen, ultimately, you can be vulnerable in this type of a setting as much, maybe not as much, but close to as much as you potentially can be in person. And vulnerability is a really important component, like we said, to successful communities. I think that there are, when it comes to online, there are a number of red flags and things to be incredibly careful and cognizant of that will make for a great online meetup event or online Fiverr event. And it's important to be very thoughtful around those. So here's a couple of examples. So number one, you know, when you're in person, you're oftentimes not all together, like, you know, the Brady Bunch, you know, images of 25 on the screen or whatever. And people can peel off into smaller groups in a more natural kind of way. So we give a lot of advice to we started a blog called meetup.com/blog with a wealth of different advice for our organizers. Please do check it out. It's free. On how to create successful online meetups. And we have a bunch of best practices. So I'll share a couple. So one example of a best practice is making sure that in every meetup event, there's like a very specific role of someone who is watching if anyone is over talking and taking over a conversation, because conversations tend to be with larger groups of people having a group conversation than sometimes smaller groups. So that's kind of one. The second role that someone needs to have even more so in online than in person is kind of a timekeeper and making sure that the things that are supposed to happen in online are happening. So there's what we say is make sure you have specific owners with very specific roles for each online event that you have to compensate for the fact that it's harder to facilitate certain things online versus in person. Another example of the thing that's super important is just using breakout groups on Zoom or other platforms. There's another platform that I like a lot called Icebreaker, which I'd recommend to people. It sounds like, Brent, you've used it.
We're big fans here of Icebreaker. We use it all the time, and really found it to be incredibly useful internally as a way to get our employees talking to our community as well. I'm sure you've experimented with that too.
It's so important. Employees to other employees, employees to community, community to community. If you're forced to just like, you know, I mean, not to compare it to what was it, 7-minute dates or something like that,
right.
Kind of things. But when you're forced to have a one-on-one conversation about a specific topic for a specific period of time and get to know someone, you know, the power of one-on-one is very powerful. And that's oftentimes what's lost in a lot of kind of the bigger group Zoom or Google Hangouts type settings. So figuring out how to spontaneity is also lost. So finding ways to create spontaneous experiences, Icebreaker, breakout groups, scavenger hunts, all those kinds of things create just much deeper levels of engagement and therefore spontaneity than kind of your very standard, you know, Zoom thing where you only see people's, you know, not even the actual images, only an image rather than actually the person because the cameras are off, you know, et cetera.
Right. That's a really great practical advice about some platforms. We're using Hopin for
Oh,
this event,
yes.
which also has some nice breakout stuff in it. But I think it's really important for people to think carefully about what kind of experience they're trying to cultivate and recognize, as you were pointing out, some of the strengths and weaknesses of various platforms, and also to keep an eye on what's coming. I mean, I feel like we've known Icebreaker for a while, but obviously it's not been around that long, and it's really starting to get some traction. And I know there are new things coming every day. So, by the way, any other technologies that you've seen that you think are promising? Not to put you on the spot.
No, no, no. It's great to be on the spot. Those are the ones that really jump out at me as where we've been um, advising a lot of our meetup organizers around. Yeah, those are the ones that I would most. But I think be comfortable with looking at solutions outside of Zoom. Zoom is great. Zoom is like the de facto, but it may not be the right solution for everyone. And be comfortable experimenting with other type platforms as well, to the
Yeah, I
extent
think
I'm
that's
allowed.
absolutely right. So when it comes to event programming, we talked a little bit about the types of events that you've seen engagement around, recently. What typically are sort of the high engagement areas for you, and you know, um, what kind of role do you guys take in helping people think about the content that they should be, putting out?
Yeah, it's like a very cut to the heart of a company platform question, right? Like you see Facebook and Twitter wrestling with
Yeah,
how much content they're involved in versus hands off in terms of content and the different perspectives on it. Um, I'll give you an example of something that we got hands-on involved in, which is around racial equality and Black Lives Matter, and the incredibly important movement that we're all seeing kind of unfold in front of us and hopefully continue for a very long time. So we are generally very hands-off, like extremely hands-off. We don't create meetup groups. We don't create meetup events. We created something called Meetup Live, where a couple of times a week we have some leaders in the field. Brent will have you on one day, kind of share their expertise. But we thought it was really important to intercede, shall we say, in our platform. And we a couple of weeks ago, we made every group related to racial equality, or helping to drive racial equality and social justice free on Meetup. And it was such a cool thing. We talked about kind of groups springing up online. When everything was happening, we had a couple of hundred groups, Black Lives Matter Jacksonville, Black Lives Matter Berlin, Black Lives Matter in all these cities in Europe, cities around the country, kind of all springing up within Meetup. And we wanted it to grow even more. So we created a larger kind of, it's called a pro group, pro network. And that will be kind of the master network, shall we say, for everything related to racial equality. So we do very little content creation and group creation and event creation ourselves. This was one of the first efforts in it, and so far it's going incredibly well. It doesn't hurt that it's free, but it's also because it's such an important movement. The next step is going to be creating groups to help each one of our organizers around different topics and or geography. So for example, if someone lives in San Francisco and there's 10,000 other organizers in San Francisco, let's make it easy for them to get together and build relationships with each other. And Meetup can create groups around that, kind of a network for organizers.
that seems really important, right? Sharing all those best practices and all those understandings. But just going back to the Black Lives Matter movement,
Sure.
it seems like you felt like in the moment it was important to sort of as I would say, almost putting a thumb on the scale, and giving something a boost, because it was important for you probably personally and also for the company to be active and taking a step in that. So I commend you guys for jumping in on that. And I think it's great if what you learned from that can apply to other things, which sounds like is sort of where it's going, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's the plan. Like, I think that many organizations, when it comes to helping to support Black Lives Matter, they potentially can be doing a disservice both to their work around racial equality and to their company by looking at it as potentially like a one-off thing. And then it ends up becoming not the popular thing in a month or 2 months or 3 months, and then it doesn't get the attention that it deserves. And racial equality it needs to continue and persist. So what we're trying to do is build a whole bunch of different product capabilities that can serve our efforts and support our efforts around it, but then be a template, like you just said, Brent, so well, for so many other things that we then can do as a company. I mean, another small example of it, and this is kind of sad we don't have this right now, but we never had the ability to create like a special, so embarrassing, but like a special shelf.
It's okay to be vulnerable, right? And that's
vulnerability. There we go.
where
In front of thousands of people, having to be vulnerable.
right.
We never had the ability to create like a shelf on our product around, let's say, different calendar-based events like July 4th events or holiday-related events. There were very category-specific, like tech events, networking events, support events. They're category specific. They weren't calendarized specific.
Right.
So we said, how can we create a shelf ultimately for Black Lives Matter related events to really highlight that capability? And we said, we don't want to just we want to do it and start with Black Lives Matter, but then we create this capability and set up the right taxonomy and tagging infrastructure that we could reuse that technology that we're creating and do it for other types of organizations and movements in the future. So by putting a little extra time into it, we're going from like a tactical thing that can help at this moment to something that could be a sustainable capability kind of for Meetup. And that's also then ultimately better for making sure that this isn't a one-off thing, but that we continue to support it as well. So I think you said it really well, which is using this as a catalyst to both help us as a product and the value we provide to our members and organizers, but then making sure that it kind of persists for the future.
Yeah, and so I guess the question is, it sounds like you're thinking about building out some new tools and capabilities to sort of help people to be better at what they're trying to do. What kind of where do you see it growing in the future? I mean, we talked a little bit about it, but what what kind of content, what kind of groups do you think will be coming to Meetup and how it'll expand? Do you see? I almost imagine that because of your work on Black Lives Matter, that there may be some more social justice organizations that may come and say, hey, Meetup's a great place to be and they care. So that's a great area of growth for you that, you wouldn't be trying to do necessarily, but it would inadvertently sort of spring off your platform as many other movements have. Where do you see it going?
Yeah, so, I mean, just because we mentioned storytelling previously, a little earlier, Meetup got its enormous jump in 2004 with the Howard Dean campaign. And it sounds like you know that, Brent.
I'm old enough to remember it and have participated.
And that campaign was a movement, as I'm sure you remember well. And Meetup has always been at the heart of lots of significant numbers, whether it was the Resist movement and Occupy Wall Street movement, many different movements and different ends of the political spectrum, fortunately, as well, not just one side. So I definitely believe that there is going to be an increased usage of Meetup around movement-related opportunities, similar to how Twitter is, so significant from that perspective as well. But I think the biggest growth opportunity for us is really in the next few months, as different cities start opening back up, and people who have been locked in little tiny rooms like you may be in right now, and have been forced for good reason to social distance, and they could start getting back to in-person again. I think the need for in-person is going to be much more top of mind for so many people, and they need to get back out in a safe way, that we're trying to use this, again, only in those countries that it's most safe to really build a movement around called a Get Back Together movement. So we have, like in New Zealand and Australia and other countries that thank God have really conquered, Hong Kong have conquered COVID. in beautiful ways, kind of using everything that's happened over the last few months as a catalyst to getting more organizers and more members to rebuild communities in their area. So our growth is going to happen as more and more people kind of start seeing the deep need for getting back together in person. And until then, we'll continue to very much support, and we will continue to support even afterwards, kind of online. And ultimately, we're going to support kind of the hybrid approach of online and in person. But I think a significant amount of growth in our future it can be a result of people's current psychological states and the awareness that they have about the power of community, how community is kind of even more important than ever, and how they could get back to community again. And
like
hopefully
it's like an 80s love song or something. You know, you don't know what you've got until it's gone. I think a lot of people have that hunger, and I'm so heartened to hear you talking about in-person community, because again, I mean, the Fiverr community and every community really that I've ever been a part of, and every sort of movement community is around getting together face to face. It builds that lasting sort of emotional loyalty that's critical to any kind of movement. So I'm really excited and heartened to hear you say that. This is just more of a plug for Meetup, really, but I've seen some of the content for this conference is about businesses and individuals that are moving from offline to online, trying to find that way to make it in this new current environment. And I want to make sure that people are aware that they can go on Meetup and just search that out, that there are going to be lots of people, both locally probably in the major markets where Fiverr is, and also globally, that they can tap into for some expertise. I just wanted to put that out there because I want to make sure that people realize what a resource Meetup is for them, even though maybe some of your meetups are even competitive with mine, but that's great.
Brent, thank you. And just for anyone who wants, I'm putting my email out there. You can email me at david@meetup.com, and I'll get back to you. And if you want to learn more about what we're doing, then feel free to email us about that. But a big growing area for us is our corporate business, where we have about 1,500 clients that create events and groups and branded, to build influence around their brands. So
that's a real organizer move. I mean, I have friends that are community organizers, and myself for many years. You get up in front of a group of people and you give them your email address, or even, God forbid, you give them your phone number. So again, hats off to you for authenticity. That is a real organizer move right there, offering up your email address. So yeah, before we go into our next session here today, I want to talk a little bit more with you about, kind of what does the future look like post-COVID. Let's imagine, it's, a year from now. Mm-hmm. I'd rather say 6 months, but let's imagine it's a year from now, and things are starting to get back to normal. What does Meetup look like in that world? I mean, you've talked about it a little bit, but what's the vision, and really where will Meetup be globally?
Yeah, so we were owned by WeWork for about 2.5 years, and we recently separated about 3 months ago. And that separation has allowed us to, and the new chairman of Meetup is a fairly well-known tech leader named Kevin Ryan. He was the founder of MongoDB and Business Insider and Zola and Gilt. And him and the board are really focused on building significantly better product experiences for our members and organizers. So a very important investment area is in kind of our communication tools, and the way in which members communicate with other members, the way members communicate with organizers. We have not evolved. We're even not even close to have evolved from a product standpoint beyond like really kind of older school message boards, et cetera. And you look at the way Airbnb or WhatsApp kind of has beautiful communications, chat-based communications, and kind of that's a significant investment in our business of really increasing the way in which we facilitate communications between people. That to me is incredibly important. The second area that I would say is what we started talking about earlier, which is how does an organizer feel like they're joining this kind of quote unquote incredible club that they couldn't get the access to prior to if they weren't a Meetup organizer. So it goes beyond technology. I think technology is is not a real point of differentiation, frankly, for Meetup or for many platforms. It's really the network that's the point of differentiation. So how do we as a company in a year from now, but really seeing it in a year from now, help to accelerate the value of being part of that network? And it goes to things like we talked about, which is building mentoring into it, into that relationship, learning best practices from others, doing joint events together. And if you had a great speaker at one event, how do you invite many other Meetup groups or Fiverr groups to be a part of to kind of co-host events together? I think there's just significant collaboration tools between organizers that we're building that will be very different in a year from now than we have right now. And on the member side, so much is almost like a Match.com or dating related app as a decent example, meaning it's about helping a person find that event that is like this amazing event experience that they've always been interested in. So it's so much comes down to building really smart algorithms. And we have, a large data science and machine learning team that helps to surface based on the types of events you've gone to, or if we don't know information about a person, then just kind of information that you get from the IP address. But we need to be great at kind of the algorithms, the matching game. And I think as a platform, being able to be a great matcher is really important. And that's where we're also investing a significant amount of time and energy into our search algorithms, our browse algorithms, et cetera.
Yeah, just going back to a point you made a second ago about the organizers themselves and teaching them how to be great at what they do and to build more communities, stronger communities, I should say. It's kind of incredible, talking to you. We'd never met prior to this, but I feel like we're sort of cut from the same cloth. And you're an academic, and there's a guy that essentially teaches community organizing at Harvard, a guy named Marshall Gans.
Yeah, sure.
Right. And so information's out there on how to be a good organizer. And yet it seems like it's not, Meetup is going to endeavor to put together this great sort of academic kind of resource to teach people how to do this. Fiverr is doing the same thing. We have our own efforts. I feel like somewhere out there, there's an opportunity for us all to get together and say, this is how you build communities, and sort of put a group stamp on it. So I'm extending that to you. Maybe we can talk about that some other time.
Absolutely.
But I think it's great, the investment in that, because from my perspective, these are tools you give to people that they can use no matter what. If you teach someone how to be an organizer, they can use it on your platform, or they can use it in their community, in their small peer group. They could use it at their church. They can use it in their PTA. These are tools because teaching people to community organizers is about teaching them how to build power. And
beautiful.
Power can be applied at any challenge. So I really commend you guys for putting in that effort. And I frankly am eager to see what you come up with in that area, because it's so important.
Thank you. I mean, the only other thing I would highlight is at some point, we also want to evolve and say, how can Meetup help someone, be a community organizer as a full-time profession, potentially? How can someone be a Meetup organizer and make a living, or a half a living, shall we say, or a side gig, and be able to charge for their higher end events, or I'm a tour guide. I love hiking in Iceland. How can I start becoming a Meetup organizer and turn that into a full-time profession? And that's something on the roadmap that we're working through as well, because as you know, and as Fiverr knows, the gig economy is growing tremendously. Fiverr is growing tremendously, and the more that more tech companies can help to support the growth of kind of the gig economy, kind of thing, I think the better for everyone. So it's another thing on our roadmap.
Completely agree, and we are seeing some of that even in our marketplace. People who are community organizers that are looking to sell their services to others, and I think that conversations like this go a long way toward legitimizing that as a career move, because I think it's previously been seen as, and again, this is hats off to Meetup for this. It's been seen as a political sort of career, or as someone who would work in advocacy, maybe with a nonprofit organization, might be a community organizer, but to transition that into Meetup, this giant platform, and for people to see that this is actually something they can go do professionally, it does create an incredible opportunity. And so, sort of to your point, Airbnb, who we mentioned earlier, they've done some interesting stuff around this, obviously, with the point you made about I like ice, hike in Iceland or whatever, and now I can turn that into an opportunity with the community. So that's it's a great ambition.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I think, that we're running out of time here, and unfortunately we can't ask questions on this session because we had a limited amount of time, but I really appreciate the time you've spent. I want to give you an opportunity to have a last word here at our community in this event, and before we move on to the next session.
Because so much is about figuring out how to build community and online in this particular time, the message that I would just say to everyone who's listening is COVID is an incredibly scary, terrible time for us around the world, but figure out on a personal level the one thing that you could be proud of that you did during this time, and you couldn't have done it if not for having this particular experience happen to each of us. And if you haven't chosen a goal, figure out what that goal is, and then come out of this on the other side and say, thank God for me this happened, because I would never have been able to build this new community. I would never have been able to rebuild a relationship with my family, whatever the aspiration happens to be. And that would be my message to everyone.
Well, that's really powerful. I think we all have probably felt some pressure to try to do that, and then maybe in the early part of this pandemic, I heard a lot of people saying they set potentially too lofty ambitions for themselves during this time. I'm going to finish my novel or whatever it is that you've been working on. But I think breaking it down into something a little more bite-sized, even rekindling relationship with your family, or even a lot of people who've even been able to rekindle relationships with family remotely by saying, oh, we're going to have a weekly. I never have been able to do a weekly dinner with my family since I've been grown, but I've somehow been able to talk to the whole group of them on Sunday night every week, which is something we didn't even do when I was a kid. So it seems like, bite-sized goals, and also just looking at the bright side of what this has all done for us, I think is a great orientation.
Yeah, the average time when people break their New Year's resolution is, I think, like February 6th. So oftentimes it's too lofty goals. So the key is small wins can create larger wins later on.
Well, you have some big wins that you're aiming for in the upcoming year, and I'm convinced you're going to make it. But I really look forward to checking in with you somewhere down the road. I really appreciate the time you've given. I think this has been a powerful and important conversation for anyone who's tuned in. And that's it for us. I think the next up is COVID and the future of creativity and accessibility. So that'll be happening on stage 1, and marketing your brand online will be on stage 2. And other than that, David, it's great talking with you. I hope to catch up with you again.
Can't wait. Take care.
Bye-bye.
See you, everyone.